You would have to leave CNS stimulants in. It's not a simple rule out.
How would you rule them out?
How would you rule out CNS stimulants?
Right.
Through the rest of the evaluation.
So there are general indicators we could look at.
There's a lot of things that we're looking at.
But your evidence for that would be?
Just my observations of him.
Okay. Now, just as a time and how a person under the influence of opiate would do on the modified Romberg drug matrix on page. Yes.
Okay, so we're at a sidebar now. We were just hearing testimony from the officer on scene who conducted the sobriety test. I'm here with Julie Rendelman. She is a LawNewz legal analyst.
Hello, how are you?
Oh, I'm good, Julie. Now, I just sat down. We've been watching this testimony. We were talking a lot about what it means to be taking something that your doctor prescribed to you, and whether or not, you know, you sit down, you take something your doctor prescribed, your doctor says you're okay to drive. Is this going to be impairment from a legal standard for what we're talking about here under the statute? I mean, what do you make of all this? There's kind of an issue with the way the law is structured, right? This is a brand new issue.
It really is kind of weird. And we were comparing it, and I couldn't think of the name. And you said dram shop. You know, there is a feeling like, you know, you have the bartender who gives someone the drinks, well aware that the person's going to be driving or whatever, or gives them too much.
Julie, we're going to have to revisit this. We're back live in the courtroom, so we're going back to the courtroom now. More on this later.
2012, yes.
And then at some point you taught students.
That's correct, sir.
And when you taught the students, you taught them from an instructor manual.
Yes.
Provided by the, well, it was provided by, but funded by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. We called it NHTSA manual.
Yes.
And when you participated in the class, you participated out of a student manual.
Yes, I received a student manual.
Okay. I'm going to show you the 2015 student manual, specifically.
Objection, can we have the state identify that that manual is applicable to?
Okay, I'm going to show them the specific page. I'm going to show you page 50 out of 75. That drug matrix I'm referring to.
So the revision date on this is 10 of 2015. I'm not sure that I've taught out of this manual because it wasn't released until 2016. I've taught A-Ride, but as far as when I teach, just like all the other instructors, I only teach portions of the information. So I don't remember exactly what I taught for each of those A-Rides to say that I specifically taught this section. So that's all I would say in regard to that, I guess.
Would you recognize that section? It's a section on the 7 drug categories.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, you're not telling us that the information that you utilized is outdated, are you?
It appears that it's it doesn't go straight through. There's parts of, anyway. Session 6, yes. I'm familiar with Session 6 for the most part.
Are you familiar with the chart I showed you?
I'm sorry, which page was that on?
I believe it was 50.
Page 50? Okay. Yes.
Okay.
It's not a complete chart. It only lists through narcotic analgesics.
Okay.
But yes.
How many drug categories are in that chart?
There are 7 drug categories listed across the top of the chart.
Okay. And what's the problem with that chart that is provided by NHTSA?
So because the way the instruction goes is you cover one category at a time. So as the training progresses, the rest of the chart would be filled in. So it's just, this is not the end chart. This is middle of the training chart.
So really the question remains, once I wipe out time estimation, which you don't agree with,
which is not on the chart, yes.
The rest of the stuff is on that chart and does make sense.
Yes, what's on, to the point we've gotten so far, that's what's on the chart, minus the X's that I don't agree with.
So, my client does have constricted pupils.
Yes, he did appear to have constricted pupils, yes.
He also has LOC, lack of convergence.
That's very correct, yes.
Which would be counter to somebody under the influence of a narcotic analgesic.
Not necessarily, because lack of convergence is one of the parts of the symptomology matrix that is not always present in all cases. So it could, and it's not always not present. So sometimes lack of convergence will show up for a category that it just doesn't make absolute sense to, because a certain portion of the population does have trouble crossing their eyes. If someone has an inability to fully cross their eyes and keep them crossed, then lack of convergence test doesn't really apply to them, and it gets thrown out. So I would say it's not absolutely applicable, because I don't know if Mr. Gaspar can cross his eyes and hold them there. I don't know if he could at that time. He said that he could.
Moving on, inhalants. We can knock that one out because Josh doesn't have HGN, doesn't have VGN. He does have lack of convergence, and his pupils would be normal. He doesn't have that. Wipe that one out as well, correct?
I would say it would be very highly unlikely that inhalants were involved. I would say that category we can pretty much rule out based on everything that I had him do.
I think I just put magic marker all over my face. Excuse me. Cannabis, marijuana. You're not going to expect to see horizontal gaze nystagmus.
No.
You're not going to expect vertical gaze nystagmus.
No.
You are going to expect lack of convergence,
Yes.
which my client had, but his pupils would appear big instead of little, dilated instead of constricted.
Except for the footnote on the matrix that says maybe normal. So footnote number 3 is dilated, maybe normal. So cannabis does not always dilate the pupils, especially synthetic cannabinoids. Definitely, so synthetic cannabinoids are lab-produced forms of that are passed off kind of like cannabis. So common examples would be spice, you may have heard of, or K2, but those are, it's basically chemicals, synthetic, and that fits in the cannabis category, but it does not always dilate pupils.
So, based on these categories that you're taught in the advanced roadside, what's it called? Advanced roadside drug interdiction?
Impaired driving enforcement.
Okay. So, based on that, we can eliminate a lot of these, or at least are not very likely, correct?
Yes, I would say, based on what we've talked about, there are 3 categories there that would be highly unlikely.
Which one are those?
CNS depressants, dissociative anesthetics,
Okay.
and inhalants.
All right. So, we're going to wipe those out. Now, are there any general indicators of a specific category of drug that we can look to determine whether or not somebody may or may not be under the influence of that drug beyond what comes out of these standardized tests? Are there observations you can make?
Yes.
All right. What are, and frankly, if you've got my chart over there.
I do.
All right. You can refer to it if you want to flip it over. See the part with the general indicators on the back there. Take a look at that and tell me if you disagree with that. I know earlier you said there were 11 general indicators for narcotic analgesics, and that's exactly how many I have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 11.
Yeah, I definitely didn't testify to that.
You don't think you said earlier that there are 11 general indicators for?
No, I never said that.
How many are there?
On what you're showing me, there are 11,
Okay.
but these are not the general indicator, not necessarily all the general indicators. Some of them are worded differently from what we use in Ohio, so I'm not sure where you got this.
I got it from the NHTSA manual. Can you go ahead and tell us the ones that would be? Let's just look at, for example, hallucinogens. We didn't wipe that one out yet, even though we have a blood test that says my client wasn't under hallucinogens. Let's see if he fits any of the indicators for hallucinogens. what do you know about the general indicators for hallucinogens? What are they?
Counsel, yes.
What are the general indicators for hallucinogens, if you know them?
The ones that are on here, obviously hallucinations that's the biggest part. Hallucinations, nausea, perspiring, dazed appearance, flashbacks.
So far, my client doesn't have any of them, right?
No.
Keep going.
Muscle tremors.
You've got those.
Yes. Uncoordinated. It has on here altered time and distance perception,
Right.
which is not on what I'm familiar with. Disoriented, memory loss, synesthesia, which is a transposition of the senses, and it's specific to hallucinogens, and difficulty with speech.
Okay. So out of all of those, which general indicators for hallucinogens would my client have exhibited?
I would say that he had some difficulty with speech. He was speaking very slow and not being transposed, and then he was disoriented at times. He seemed to have some memory loss issues with at least his short-term memory. At times, well, most times, any time that I had him doing tests, he had muscle tremors.
Now, do you take into effect the fact that this guy had just run somebody over and killed them?
At the time that he was doing the test, he didn't know that Kenny had died.
Were you aware that he had stayed about 10 feet from Kenny for an hour, watching him be worked on by the medics, seeing the, you know, aware of that?
No, I'm not aware of that. No, how long did you say, 10 minutes?
I think he stayed there about an hour before. When did you get there?
Yeah, well, Kenny definitely wasn't on scene for an hour.
No, I just mean quite a big pool of blood.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, what was your question to me?
Did you take into account when determining whether or not my client had some of these issues with attention or memory loss, that he had just been involved in a horrific accident?
A lot of people are involved in crashes, certainly. I took into account that he had been involved in something pretty serious. That's why throughout the time that I spoke with him leading up to field sobriety tests, I tried to speak with him in a pretty even tone, just like I'm talking now. It's pretty much how I talk. Knowing that what I didn't want was for him to exhibit effects based on anything that I was adding to his stress.
Do you really think there's anything you could have done to add to his stress at that point in time?
If there's anything I could have done to add to it, absolutely. There's some things I could do to add to his stress. I wanted to detract from that, and so I wanted to speak with him calmly, try to build some rapport with him, and thank you so much. Try to put him at ease as much as I could. He seemed like he was somewhat joking with me, especially after the finger to nose. You know, he seemed very comfortable. He said, you know, so how did I do? And I said, I've seen better. And he was like, yeah, that was pretty bad. And I said, well, you know, it's kind of embarrassing when he messed up the left-right thing. So we discussed that stuff. I've certainly seen people who are experiencing what's considered psychological shock or acute stress reactions, another name for it, where somebody experiences something really horrible, like a crash or along those lines, where it's something that really affects them hard, and they're like telling them that their family's not coming home again. That kind of thing really affects somebody in the immediate, but then the longer you spend time with them, most people will come out of that and you see that change in them. So, you know, I go to make a death notifications at someone's house. A lot of people to call, those types of things. But then when we're there at the house for 10, 15, 20 minutes into that experience.
Can I stop you there?
Sure.
Can I stop you there? Okay. We can agree, though, that my client's telling you that his knees are weak. Not from injury, but because he's so scared. Did he tell you that?
No, he didn't say because he was so scared. He said because of the nervousness, is what he said.
You said that you could see his heart pounding through his neck.
Yes.
The reality is, no matter how calming an influence you are, he's just killed somebody, and he's doing a field sobriety test in front of cameras on the side of the road, knowing full well that if he doesn't pass these tests, he's going to jail.
Objection, Your Honor.
You think you can calm that down?
Based on what I saw in him, he didn't seem to be overly nervous. I've certainly had someone do field sobriety tests before where they realize that they're tremoring. And so they'd say, I'm nervous, or I'm cold, or they make excuses for what's obviously visible. So no, I didn't take that into account any further than what it was said.
Hallucinogens, we talked about those. Let's go to cannabis. Some of the general indicators that law enforcement uses to determine whether somebody's under the influence of cannabis are...
Sure.
Do you know them?
Yes, reddening of the conjunctiva, odor of marijuana, marijuana debris in the mouth, body tremors,
Got those.
increased appetite, relaxed inhibitions, disoriented, possible paranoia, altered time distance perception, eyelid tremors.
Okay. So out of those, what did you find in my client?
An altered perception of distance,
You're basing that on what?
a finger to nose test, just not landing where he needed to be. See if there's anything else that fits into there, but disoriented, body tremors.
Okay. So based on the general indicators that you've learned in your training, my client could very well be under the influence of marijuana.
I didn't really get to do a full eval, so there's some of these on here that, like marijuana debris in the mouth, I never looked in his mouth. I wouldn't expect to see anything, but so to just be fair, I didn't do the full eval, so I'm not going to necessarily be able to see all of what's listed as general indicators.
Now you're aware though that your blood test, urine test that your lab did tested for marijuana.
Yes,
And
definitely.
my client's not under the influence of marijuana.
No, there's no marijuana, there's no cannabis in his system whatsoever, no.
Well, let's focus on what we are saying he's impaired by. What are the signs of somebody being impaired by a narcotic analgesic? What would we expect to see in those folks? The general indicators.
So narcotic analgesics, general indicators listed here are droopy eyelids,
Okay. Did my client have droopy eyelids?
the opposite,
Wide open.
wide open.
Okay. What else?
On the nod.
What does that mean?
So on the nod is something that is typically seen, and it's pretty much reserved for the narcotic analgesic category. It's where someone has an inability to keep their eyes open and an inability to keep their head up. So the only way that we can keep, through the drug influence evaluation, some of what we do is pupil size measurement and horizontal gaze nystagmus, which requires someone's eyes to be open to be able to view their eyes. And a lot of times, narcotic analgesic category, we have to coach someone through. We have to keep telling them, keep your eyes open, keep your eyes open, keep your eyes open. A lot of times they're able to do that, but they look like this. Their eyes are forced open, and they have that wide open look to their eyes.
My client didn't have that.
He did not have, he was not on the nod, no.
What's the next?
Drowsiness.
My client appear sleepy to you?
No, he didn't fall asleep, didn't appear sleeping.
What's the next one?
Depressed reflexes.
Did you see any depressed reflexes?
The opposite.
His reflexes seem to be...
He was very rigid.
Okay. So that would be counter to a finding that he's impaired by narcotic analgesics, the fact that he is so rigid.
Yeah, and it's just not that simple to say. Narcotic analgesics category. So again, these are things, if it's psychoactive at the time, if it's coursing through and they're feeling the effects of it. The opposite is what's called downside effect. It's where your body has come off the drug and it's desperately trying to get back to what's called homeostasis. So that's like your baseline. It's the dynamic balance of everything that you have in your body. All the chemicals that your body naturally produces stay at a nice even balance. When you take a drug that drives you down, such as methadone or any narcotic analgesic, then what your body does to fight the drug is it starts pumping things to speed up the sympathetic nervous system. So it's working to speed up your body. When your body starts to come off the drug, your body starts to win that battle for homeostasis. And so you start to see opposite effects of what you would see if that drug was actually pounding away in your body.
So basically, the fact that my client does not exhibit depressed reflexes, but the opposite would indicate that maybe he is coming off the influence of a narcotic analgesic and not under that influence? His body's driving it back out?
It could be that his body is influenced from an absence of a drug that he's supposed to be on. Yes, it could be that.
What's next?
Dry mouth.
Now, I've noticed you've gone through 2 waters already.
Been doing a lot of talking, sir.
My client asked for any water or anything?
Yes. He did ask for water when we were at the hospital. He was provided with water when he was there.
Anything that would make you think he had an excessively dry mouth? Or?
He had a low raspy voice, a raspy voice the way mine sounds from talking. And it was lower, sounded kind of a low tone voice.
Do you know what his voice normally sounds like?
I do not know.
Some people have low voices.
That's very true, yes.
Some folks have raspy voices.
Some people do, yes.
Do you know if he smokes?
No.
Do you hear a
I don't.
smoker's voice? How they sometimes?
Certainly.
Okay. So he had a low raspy voice, and that's a general indicator.
It is, yes.
So far we've got no droopy eyelids, not on the nod, not drowsy, not depressed reflexes, and on the dry mouth, maybe, maybe not. But he does have a low raspy speech, according to you.
Low, raspy, slow speech, yes, according to me, as well as according to Matrix, yes.
But you have no idea what his normal speech pattern or sound of his voice is.
I'd never talked with him before, no.
What's next?
Euphoria?
Did he seem to be euphoric?
No, definitely not euphoric.
What's another general indicator?
Puncture marks?
Now, I noticed you had a good look at him when you walked around him on that modified Romberg. See any needle marks?
I did not notice any needle marks, but again, when we check for signs of ingestion is the step that's looked for, we look beyond just the typical places where people would inject, and also sometimes needle marks are really hard to see, so that's it's not just a stand back and look at somebody to see a needle mark. A lot of people hide use of needles, so it's a pretty in-depth look at a person.
You didn't see it?
I did not see any, no.
What about next?
Itching?
Did you see him itching?
No, I don't recall him itching.
What's next?
Nausea?
Okay. Did he seem nauseous to you?
No, he did not. He did not complain of being nauseous either.
And finally?
Slowed breathing?
Did he appear to suffer from slow breathing?
No. No, I wouldn't say that he had slowed breathing.
So based on the 11 general indicators that we can use to determine whether or not somebody is being influenced by a substance, specifically narcotic analgesics, my client exhibited 1 out of 11, a low raspy voice.
Of the viewable ones that I had, yes, I would say That's what's on the symptomology matrix.
Okay.
Indicators.
So, the test you did and the observations you made were pretty good, as best you can do in the field, right?
As far as what I did,
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I would say I followed protocol. I followed the standardization of the tests. Yes.
Would you agree with me, though, that there is a much more stringent process by which an individual can be evaluated for the influence of substances, of drugs, by a law enforcement officer?
Yes.
And beyond what they taught you in the 2-day SFT course, Standardized Field Sobriety, right? Beyond that, there's also a 2-day A-Ride course you went to, right?
Yes.
And then there was a 2-week course that you attended, a drug recognition expert course, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And that's 72 hours of actual instruction?
Yes, if you combine the preliminary school with the it's called the 7-day school. If you combine them together, yes.
Now, A-Ride you talked to is a bridge between the basic field sobriety test and the advanced drug recognition evaluation, right?
Yes, that's correct.
An A-Ride trained officer is supposed to be able to know when it's smart to bring in a DRE, to bring in a guy who can come and do the real test.
I would say that's a good characterization, yes.
And the tests you did on my client were the tests that are consistent with an A-Ride evaluation.
I went beyond what's part of A-Ride.
You're not indicating that you did a DRE, are you?
No.
Tell the jury what a DRE is.
So a DRE that's an acronym for Drug Recognition Expert. Basically, it's a further trained officer who can then delve in further with a person who's suspected to be under the influence and make a determination as to whether or not, number one, that person is impaired, number two, whether that person is impaired by a drug category, and then number three, what category of drugs of the 7 categories that are on the board there, the person is under the influence of, and category or categories in the case of polydrug use.
It's a 12-step process, is it not?
It is a 12-step process, yes.
It takes maybe an hour, maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours.
I don't know that I've ever gone 2 hours on the evaluation, but I've certainly, I think the longest I've probably gone is an hour and 40 minutes. And that's because there's an interview portion. So sometimes people talk more than others, and so that prolongs the exam usually.
Extremely thorough exam, is it not?
Yes, very thorough.
You check pulse at different points on the body.
No, it's a radial pulse, so you check the pulse 3 times during the evaluation, 3 different times.
Check blood pressure.
Yes.
You check the eyes and how they dilate or constrict.
Yes, we measure pupil size using a pupilometer.
You have a special room that you take them into where it's dark, and you put them in a dark room and look at their eyes.
I wouldn't say we have a special room that we take them in, but we definitely darken the room that they're in.
I mean, it's black in there, isn't it?
It's pretty dark, yes.
You have to use a little flashlight, and you hold your hand over it so that it doesn't affect it, and then you check their eyes out to see what happens, how they bounce back.
It's not exactly how that works, but yes, we check their eyes in 3 phases of light. In room light, the room that typically they're in, then in near total darkness, so that's when we darken the room or take them to another room that can be darkened. Typically it's a room without windows just to prevent any room light from entering, or any outside light from entering the room. And then we have to we use a pen light, and we cover the pen light with our thumb so that the only light that's emitted from that pen light is coming through our thumb, and so it gives a red glow. A lot of times we're able to see, especially like with Mr. Gaspar and his bright blue eyes, we'll be able to see his pupils very easily with the glow. Someone with much darker eyes, though, we have a black light that we use to light the back of the eye up so that we can then see the pupil for measurement. And then, like you described, there is a direct light measurement where we shine a light directly in someone's eyes and measure the pupil's reaction to that introduction of light, and then also look for pupillary unrest, which is a change in the pupil's eyes where it just doesn't stay one size, or rebound and dilation is another thing that we're looking for when we do that. Checking to see that if someone's eye constricts down initially, but then dilates and never returns to that constricted size. So yes, we're certainly looking at pupil size.
You feel their muscles to determine whether they're rigid or not. You put your hands on them and squeeze.
Yes, muscle tone is part of the evaluation.
You do all the other standardized field sobriety tests again too. You do the walk and turn and the one leg stand, the HGN all over again?
Yes.
Okay. And you interview them and you ask them questions. What are you on? When did you take it? That's part of the process, is it not?
Yes, it is.
And there's more to it. I know I'm missing. You look for needle marks. You do a real slow look, better than the one you can do in the field, and check them to see whether they got puncture marks.
Using a magnifying glass, yes.
Okay. And ultimately, you get a tox sample from them, and you send that off to the lab to confirm your findings.
That's what we ask for, yes. We ask them for a tox sample.
Okay. And so, based on all of the information that you receive from this really extensive test, you then make a judgment call as to what category of drugs, if any, you think they're under.
Prior to the toxicology, yes.
And then your work gets checked by a confirmation test. You could say, hey, this guy's under this guy's under this, and the blood test will come back and tell you if you're right.
Not inconclusively,
Okay.
no. But yes, my work gets sent for peer review, and it gets looked at.
You would agree with me that that DRE test is much, much more thorough than the test that you did on my client.
Absolutely, I would agree with that.
Had you done that, we could have much, much more confidence in claiming that my client was under this category or that category, because there'd be a lot more information.
There would be a lot more information. I would have a very clear picture as to what was going on with Mr. Gaspar.
But yet, that did not happen.
No, it did not.
Now, even on these really, really advanced tests that you do, sometimes you can get it wrong, can you not?
As far as my overall call and
Yeah.
what turns out in their system, yes,
You keep what's called a rolling log, don't you?
I do, yes.
Well, what's a rolling log?
A rolling log is a rolling log of my evaluations. So every evaluation that I complete has a number assigned to it. It has the person's name. It has my call, what I believe that they were under the influence of, what type of toxicology sample was taken, what the lab test came back as. Also has a place for report number, the date of the evaluation, and the age or the date of birth of the person involved. So there's a lot of information on there.
You're probably aware that I requested and have your rolling log.
Yes.
Okay. Are you pretty well versed in your rolling log?
You mean well versed, like do I know it by heart?
Yeah.
Not really, no.
Do you know how many DRE evaluations you've done?
On 139.
Do you know how many that you've just been the evaluator as opposed to the instructor or as opposed to a test in testing?
No, not off the top of my head.
Okay. Do you know what your percentage of correct calls is?
I did look into my rolling log. I think I had 66 enforcement evaluations, and the rest of my 139 are either instructor or student evaluations.
Right. We had 64, but we'll go with 66.
Okay. I think that I had 96% correct calls, including instructor and student evals. I think it's 89% if we're looking at only enforcement evals.
Well, what we have, we can go over them. We have 64 that you did, and out of that 64 evaluations, you did this very thorough test. There were 7 times that you claimed an individual was under the influence of a drug, and then the drug test later said, no, he wasn't. You remember Dylan Baker?
Dylan Baker. You have the date?
I do. December 30th, 2012.
Dylan Baker crashed his car in northwest Wayne County. The officer on scene arrested him for impairment. Dylan Baker looked under the influence, and when asked during the interview, he said that his blood and his urine are going to come back clean because what he's on, we will not find.
You claim that he was on a narcotic analgesic.
Yes.
Just like you did my client, right?
Yes.
And it came back that he was not under narcotic analgesic.
He was correct.
How about Michael Gaynor? Remember him? 6/15/2013.
No, I don't.
You claim Michael was under a CNS depressant and a narcotic, and he was arrested and charged with that until the blood test came back negative.
Is that my arrest?
You were an evaluator and a recorder.
To the right of that, does it have any information?
Tox type B, roll ER. It says roll evaluator recorder.
Sure. Is there anything beyond that? Is it blank?
It's blank.
Okay. So that usually means that's my enforcement evaluation. What was the name again? Gaynor?
Yeah, Michael Gaynor.
And that's a 2013?
Yeah, June.
Okay. Michael Gaynor was involved in a crash, State Route 585 in Wayne County. And Michael Gaynor admitted to snorting Xanax and taking heroin. By the time there was a toxicological exam, all the drugs had metabolized through his blood, and we should have gotten a urine test because they would have shown up in his urine.
When did you do your DRE on him?
I'm sorry?
When did you do your DRE on him?
Hours after the crash at the hospital.
So you're telling us that within hours you took a blood test on him, within hours he metabolized all that? Because the test that you did do a couple hours later said he didn't have any of that in his system.
Yeah, it was really puzzling on that one. So we called the lab and checked with the lab because it just didn't make any sense because of his admissions, and he was so clearly under the influence. All the indicators were there to indicate that he was under the influence of a CNS depressant and a narcotic analgesic. So the lab confirmed that he was presumptive positive for both categories, but because of the confirmation testing being so high that they couldn't say in his blood that he still had enough of that drug in his system, in his blood. So even though it was psychoactive, I could still see it. It had already moved through his blood, and urine would have been the only way to show that he had it. And unfortunately, we didn't take urine in that case.
Do you remember accusing Robert Elliott of being under the influence of a narcotic analgesic in October 2013 and having him arrested? Only to have a drug test come back later that he had no drugs in his system after your very thorough exam? We can move on.
I was going to say, what's to the right of that? Is there anything?
Evaluator, recorder. That's you.
It's blank all the way out to the right?
It does say P70.
Okay, so that's another one. So P70 is the Mansfield post of the Ohio State Highway Patrol. They called me and asked me to do an evaluation for them. That's another admitted heroin injection, and that's a blood test, right? It's a blood test where that heroin had metabolized out of his system. Not out of his system, but it had metabolized out of his blood to such a degree. Yet again, that's another one where we called the lab and said that he's very clearly under the influence of a narcotic.
This is another case where you disagree with your own lab.
No, the lab confirmed that he had the metabolites of heroin in his blood, but at such a low amount because it had already metabolized that they couldn't say that it was positive in the blood only, so urine would have showed it, but we didn't draw urine. His girlfriend in that case actually admitted that they had just shot up together because she was in the post lobby, and after the interview with him, I went out and talked with her about getting help because he was on the way to death.
What about Dustin Mace? He said that Dustin Mace was under a central nervous system stimulant like cocaine or methamphetamine. He came back negative too. Or Scott McRae, said he was under a stimulant, -2. Or Jonathan Martinowski, you said he was under a narcotic.
Counselor, can you slow down? I'm trying to track the names.
Jonathan Martinowski, you said he was under the influence for narcotic cannabis, didn't come back positive for a narcotic. Didn't come back positive for cannabis. I mean, we can agree with you. We can agree that even with your 2-week course, this stuff's not perfect, is it?
No, anything that has anything to do with the human body is not going to be 100% foolproof ever. There's certainly room for error, and like we talked about before, downside effect is a real thing. When someone shows opposite effects of a drug, when they start to come off a drug, they start to go into actually withdrawal. They'll show opposite effects, which can mimic psychoactive effects of a drug. So it's not always going to be exact, but it's pretty great, and the numbers are reflective of that. The majority of the time, I do make correct calls, as do DREs all over the world.
Well, majority of the time, but out of your 64, 7 folks were wrongfully accused.
I completely disagree with that.
Okay. A couple of them you didn't get right. I mean, you've got a lot of answers for this one's told you this and this one told you that, but basically, you said they were under influence and a blood test said no.
Objection, Your Honor.
I'll withdraw. Isn't there some danger to having police officers go out there and do these medical tests when they don't have the medical training?
Yeah, these are tests the medical field uses, but you don't need medical training to do them. Some of these things like blood pressure, it doesn't take medical training to be able to pump up a blood pressure cuff and view where the needle is and listen to the Korsakoff sounds, the sounds that your blood makes as they go through your vessels. Checking someone's pulse does not take medical training. Measuring pupil size does not take medical training.
But making a diagnosis that somebody is under the influence of a chemical and how that chemical affects their body based on medical tests, used to have a doctor do it with a 4-year degree, not a police officer with a 2-week course.
Objection, Your Honor.
You don't have the training a doctor has, right?
No, I'm not a doctor.
And you haven't even really been in this DRE stuff since, when was the last time you did a DRE?
2 weeks ago today.
Okay. You're doing the administrative stuff now, though, right?
I'm a post commander now, so I do a lot less on the road enforcement. But when someone's arrested for driving under the influence and drugs are suspected, typically they're brought back to the post. So if I'm available to do an evaluation, then I'll do an evaluation.
I guess my issue is, you didn't even do a DRE on my client.
I did not have the opportunity, no.
You did some roadside tests, of which he passed a lot of them, and then you arrested him and say that he's impaired. That's pretty safe to say?
No, I wouldn't say he passed the tests. I would say I observed marked impairment on him, and he was arrested for driving under the influence. He was arrested for the impairment that
Now,
I
you
saw.
talked about that, and some of the impairment you said was, oh, he's really rigid, and driving like that would be impairing, right?
Yes.
Do you really think he's driving that rigid? Don't you think he's scared to death out there?
Do I think he's scared to death while driving? I'm
do you
sorry,
think
I
he's
misunderstand your question. Can you repeat?
Do you think that he drives his car with his fist balled, scared, clenching, or do you think that was a result of maybe just hitting somebody and killing them and then doing roadside tests?
Objection, Your Honor.
I don't know exactly what he was doing prior to the crash. What I did see in him was a lot of rigidity. He was very stiff, very rigid, very his fist kept balling up like you described.
And that's not a validated clue anywhere.
It's not a validated clue anywhere, no.
No science behind that.
I'm sorry, I would say there are a lot of studies going on that say that someone with rigid muscle tone certainly could be under the influence of a drug, yes.
Could be. Do you have any familiarity with how fear affects somebody? The fear of going to jail, the fear of being accused of killing somebody?
Well, there's a lot of people that fear the police. And so in my daily interactions, working the roads, certainly I've run into a lot of people that fear arrest. They fear the consequences of
You can't
what's
see the
going
difference
on.
between this and that, though?
I've certainly dealt with a lot of people that have just killed somebody in a crash and that interview that follows. And rigidity to this degree is not something that is typical and not something I normally would see. No.
You made a big deal out of the fact that my client couldn't follow simple directions, right?
I guess if you characterize it as a big deal, then yeah, I definitely said he had trouble following directions. Sure.
And that was one of the factors that led you to believe that he was impaired?
Yes.
Okay. And by my count, you were told 7 times to slow down. I was probably told 20 times to slow down, and neither one of us has followed that direction very well. Agree with me?
I don't know what the count would be, but yes, I continually try to get information in, so I speed up my speech.
And the judge told you, slow down, and the court reporter told me to slow down, and I don't think either one of us is impaired.
I would agree that I'm not impaired.
Okay. Stress. Got that one in there. Stress. Stress can cause folks to have trouble focusing. Fear can cause folks to not respond the way a person who's not in fear for their life is going to respond. Would you agree with me on that?
Stress certainly affects your ability to think clearly, yes. I agree that stress can do that, yes. It can also sharpen you at times, so it just depends on how your body's going to react.
If my client exhibited 17 clues or 11 indicators, you'd be in here saying, look at all these clues, look at all these indicators, he's clearly impaired. But the fact that he didn't have those indicators and didn't have those clues doesn't mean the opposite to you. You won't say, you're right, he doesn't exhibit all the signs that somebody under the influence of this drug would exhibit. You won't say that. Why?
Because I've never done an evaluation where someone exhibited all the clues ever. I've never done that.
You've certainly seen a lot more than this guy. You've certainly seen guys who get 6 out of 6 on HGN, right?
Yes, absolutely.
You've certainly seen 8 out of 8 on the walk and turn, and 4 out of 4 on the one-leg stand. You've seen those over and over.
It's actually pretty rare for someone to exhibit all 8 clues or all 4 clues on either of the divided attention skills tests. And HGN, because it's most of the time when we're looking at HGN, we're looking at alcohol, and a lot of people that we are arresting or having do that, the HGN test, do exhibit 6 clues of HGN because statistically 4 or more clues equals a blood alcohol content of 0.08 or higher, and there's a lot of people that drive at double that. So yes, I see a lot of 6 of 6 HGN, but not in relation to drugged driving. When drugged driving is involved, HGN is not as prevalent. I don't see HGN in a lot of the drug driving cases. So frankly, I would have been surprised to see it in this case.
Okay. Well, based on your evaluation of my client, not on the blood test, but on the evaluation, what is your opinion as to what drug category he was under the influence of?
I don't have enough information to formulate an opinion as to exactly what drug category was influencing him, or categories.
But all these drug categories have different indicators, some exactly opposite from others, right?
That's absolutely right, yes.
So if you don't have enough information to categorize them, you don't have enough information to make that call in the beginning.
I don't have enough information to make the call as to what drug category he's under the influence of, but based on the totality of the circumstances, from the crash itself and the way it happened, to my interaction at the car with his wide open eyes, his constricted pupils, the way that he's answering questions slow, and that I have to keep repeating questions to him to get him to understand. It's a totality of the circumstances, judgment on impairment.
Where does totality of the circumstances ever come out in the NHTSA manuals? What's the point of all these clues and all these tests if you can disregard them and just say, I think he's high anyway?
Judge, can we have one? Sure.
Lieutenant, would you agree with me that the test you did and some of the findings could indicate use of a lot of different substances?
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
Would you agree with me that the test you did and the findings that you made pursuant to those tests could indicate several different categories of drug use on behalf of my client? Could be this, could be that.
Not necessarily it could be this, could be that. I would say that based on my limited observation of him, I could narrow down a few categories, but I can't make a determination as to what drugs necessarily.
What categories?
I would say CNS stimulants, narcotic analgesics, and cannabis are the three categories that I would certainly be interested in based on the limited amount of time that I was able to view him without doing a complete evaluation.
And despite those findings, we have a blood test that indicates that my client was on his therapeutic level of methadone. Do you disagree with that blood test?
I don't know. You're saying therapeutic dose. I don't know what a therapeutic dose necessarily is.
Do you disagree with the findings in the Ohio State Highway Patrol blood test and urine test that was done to my client immediately after this crash?
Do I disagree? And
Are you still trying to say that he's on something else and we just don't know it?
I'm saying that's possible. I'm saying that's possible, that he could have something synthetic that the lab does not test for in his system. And that's happened several times in my rolling log as well, where someone's clearly under the influence, they've admitted use of spice, and it comes back negative from the lab. That's my experience.
If I'll agree with you on that, would you agree with me that it's just as possible that my client wasn't not impaired by anything other than fear, and this is just an accident?
I would
Possible?
say I would say that yes, that's possible.
Thank you.
Because
Thank you, Lieutenant.
Lieutenant, can you please finish your answer to that question?
because I didn't have the opportunity to do a complete drug influence evaluation with Mr. Gaspar. Had I had that opportunity, then yes, I could have ruled out any other factor and could have ruled in the drug categories that were actually at play. I could have narrowed that down and made that determination, absolutely, without a doubt.
Lieutenant, you were asked a lot of questions about not completing a full evaluation of the defendant. Why was a full evaluation of this defendant not completed?
Because he invoked Miranda. A lot of the evaluation is asking him questions. So I made a phone call to our DRE state coordinator, our drug recognition expert state coordinator. I let him know that Mr. Gaspar did not want to speak without an attorney present. We discussed whether or not I should continue with the evaluation and just skip over the steps that include talking with him, which takes us out of our standardized and systematic protocol. He made a phone call, called me back and said that it's advised that we don't continue with the evaluation. So I was unable to complete one.
So because the defendant invoked his right to counsel, which he is allowed to do.
Absolutely.
You were not able to complete the exam, which would have allowed.
Sustained.
You were not allowed to complete a full exam of this defendant, correct?
I was advised not to continue further with the evaluation.
If you had completed a full evaluation of this defendant, would you have been able to determine which category the defendant?
That is not the subject he's going to answer upon. You're asking him to speculate. The defendant had the right not to cooperate.
Yes.
He has Miranda rights. So he invoked him, and the jury may not consider that for any purpose.
Can you explain the process that's typically completed for the examination?
The first step is a breath test. Then it moves into an interview of the arresting officer, which would have been me in this particular instance. The reason for the interview is just to see what, if anything, may have changed. So just like with alcohol, all drugs have a duration of effects, and they dissipate over time in the body. So as alcohol is eliminated from the body, somebody becomes less and less impaired. The same can be said for a lot of the drug categories as well. As the drug dissipates from the body, the person becomes less and less impaired. So we need to talk with the officer, see what they were seeing, see what, if anything, the defendant said about any ingestion or to kind of gauge that duration of effects. And then to make sure that the officer saw something indicative of impairment, that they ran them through tests and that they made a good determination that the person was impaired. Then we move into first pulse and preliminary examination, which is where we take the very first pulse of that person, and then we talk with them about, and the very first thing on that list of things to talk about is, was Miranda read to you? And then we put in there who did it, just to be sure. A lot of times if I'm doing an evaluation, I go ahead and just re-Mirandize a person just to make sure that they completely understand that I'm going to be asking them questions. Those questions include how much sleep they've had, how much they've had to eat, if anything, whether or not they've had anything to drink, what they've had to drink, whether or not they're sick, whether or not they're hurt or injured, whether or not they have epilepsy, whether or not or if they're diabetic, whether or not they take insulin. It's just a myriad of questions that we ask somebody as part of the influence evaluation. Then we move into eye examinations, which include horizontal gaze nystagmus, vertical gaze nystagmus, and lack of convergence. Then we move into vital signs, which includes a second pulse, and blood pressure measurement and body temperature. Then we move into psychophysical tests, including modified Romberg balance, walk and turn, one leg stand, both left and right foot, and the finger to nose test. Then we move into muscle tone, and so we basically palpate or manipulate the muscles. Typically what is used is the arms, so I'll just feel the arms for rigidity or flaccidity, looking for them to be rigid like tight, or flaccid like very loose, or normal. And typically what we'll do is hold at the wrist and the elbow and just manipulate the arm just to see. A lot of times rigid muscles equal rigid movements, so this kind of manipulation becomes forced. Whereas a flaccid muscle tone typically becomes kind of like a wet noodle, where it's very loose and things move easily. And then normal, it feels like normal. We've all held someone's hand and pulled, you know, we know what that feels like. The ninth step would be the final pulse, and then a check for injection signs, looking to see what we find. Then muscle tone is 10th, and then we move into the interview with them. We make a determination, and then there's a toxicological exam.
When you were asked a lot of questions about the number of clues or indicators that the defendant exhibited through your standardized field sobriety test, do you recall those questions?
Yes.
And administering the standardized field sobriety test, is there a percentage of clues or some sort of count at the bottom of the test that's how you determine impairment?
Can you restate your question just so I make sure I understand what you're asking before I answer? And I think I understand what you're asking.
At the end of the standardized field sobriety test, do you tally up all the cues or indicators that are present? And if a certain number is present, then that's impairment?
No, that's not how that works.
Can you explain to me how that actually works?
So we're talking about standardized clues, and that's the only where we number them. There's a certain number of clues we're looking for. Those are the standardized tests with validated clues. So in horizontal gaze nystagmus, typically we're looking for 4 clues to determine that someone's going to test over 0.08. The current studies that are being used say that's 88% accurate, and so we rely on that test pretty good, especially when we're talking about alcohol. Walk and turn and one leg stand, different studies at different times, but walk and turn 79% accurate in determining by itself, in determining whether or not someone is going to test over a per se limit, 0.08. And then one leg stand is 83% if a person exhibits 2 or more clues. So when we look at everything as a whole in those tests, just because they exhibit clues in the test doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be an arrest. I've certainly had people exhibit some clues where an arrest wasn't made because the other factors that are involved are just not sufficient enough to support arresting that person for being under the influence. Or through that test, I see some things in them, so that leads me to ask a follow-up question or two that kind of explains why I'm seeing what I'm seeing, and then they're ruled out from arrest. But when it comes to drug influence, HGN, like I said before, is not always there, because you only really see HGN in 3 out of the 7 categories. And inhalants are very, very impairing, so we very rarely run into someone behind the wheel that's using inhalants. And dissociative anesthetics, again, are very, very impairing. So although we do see some dissociative anesthetics in the Cleveland area, dissociative anesthetics are not typically something that we see people driving under the influence of. In my experience, PCP has been the only one that's shown up in a driver, and they were absolutely impaired. So central nervous system depressants is the only category that we typically, when we're talking drug influence, would see horizontal gaze nystagmus. So there's been a lot of weight put on that in this case, but it's not something we normally would see when we're talking about just drug influence.
Now, you were asked a lot of questions about your observations outside of the validated cue. Why are you making observations outside these validated clues?
That's certainly part of the training that we go through for both ARIDE and DRE. The other clues that I'm looking for are very similar to what the defense has given me, the general indicator. So there's a lot of other things that we're looking for and that we follow.
In regards to Defense Exhibit A, you summed it up there. Is this typically what you use in your assessment?
No, this is the time estimation part on here. That just doesn't exist, and I don't, at least not in Ohio ARIDE courses. I've never seen that on a symptomology matrix until today, so I'm a little surprised to see it now, and it's not even accurate as I look at it. So, but yes, I do have a symptomology matrix. I do review that symptomology matrix on my evaluations, and that is what we use typically to help classify what drug category a person is under the influence of.
Can you briefly, if possible, explain to us, you indicated that Defense Exhibit A is inaccurate. Can you explain to us what's inaccurate about it?
Just what I see on here, it says time estimation, and there's it's the bottom row. Time estimation is the one that's crossed out on the board. That's not accurate.
And in terms of the bottom half of that card, does that include all of the possible indicators you could?
No, definitely not. So these are general indicators. These are some of the things that you could see, but it's not a complete list because drugs vary. So there's a lot of different drugs for each category. And I think I named out a lot of different drugs when we talked about the categories. So some drugs exhibit some of these general indicators. Some of the drugs in those categories do not exhibit some of these general indicators. So it's not that if someone's categorized in one of those drug categories, they're not always going to exhibit, they're certainly not going to always exhibit everything in that general indicators block.
Now, you were asked some questions about the defendant indicating that his knees were weak. Do you recall those?
He definitely said that during the walk and turn, during the instruction phase. He said that his knees were weak and because he was nervous.
Yeah, you still administer a standardized field sobriety test, correct?
Yes.
Why?
When I asked him if he had any problem with his neck, back, or legs at all, he indicated to me that he had some back problems. He never indicated to me knee problems or weak knees. The walk and turn test was the first test that I had him basically stand still and balance, and that was the first time that his leg and body tremors were really evident. In my experience, that's typically when someone realizes they're tremoring really bad is when they give an excuse for that. So I told him I'll try to hurry, give you these instructions so that you can just do the test. Trying to put him at ease, let him know that it's not going to be much longer before you start this test.
So if someone is simply nervous in performing the standardized field sobriety sobriety tests, are they still administered?
Yes.
Why?
Because nervousness, most of the time when someone's doing these tests, there's a degree of nervousness involved. So that's pretty standard for everybody that's doing these tests. So that's included in the field validation studies. So a field validation study was done with the field validation studies that have been done have all been with officers and subjects who were arrested for driving under the influence. So that's factored into the validation.
If someone is afraid or in fear, is the standardized field sobriety test still administered?
Yes, absolutely.
Why?
Because the person can still absolutely be impaired by a substance despite being afraid. Their impairment can still be evident.
You were asked some questions about the modified Bromberg balance test in regards to observing the count. Do you recall that question?
In regards to observing the count?
Yes, or somebody's pacing.
Yes.
You were attempting to answer about there being more observations than that. Can you explain if there are more observations than just numbers involved with that?
Just body cues, the way that their body is, looking for tremoring, rigidity, looking for some people open and close their eyes, which is different than what's instructed. Some people sink down, some people flex their legs. You're looking for them to do anything other than what's been instructed. Stand still with your head tilted back, your eyes closed, and estimate the passage of 30 seconds. So anything beyond that stands out, and people do a lot of different things during that test.
And why are you looking for these other indicators or clues?
Because the person's been told to do something very specific, and it's very simple. And if they don't follow the very simple directions of standing still with their head tilted back and their eyes closed to estimate the passage of 30 seconds, then there's something going on with that person. Whether it's something I observe physically or it's something I observe through a mental impairment and inability to follow directions, whatever it is, there's cognitive or physical impairment that can be seen through that test.
You were asked some questions in regards to the chart that is listed out on this board. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And initially when you were asked those questions, you indicated that this chart was incorrect or inaccurate, correct?
Yes.
Can you explain to us what's inaccurate about what is on the board?
The bottom line. I've never seen it before.
In regards to what is on the board, does it address if there are multiple categories used?
To back up and finish, I guess, the bottom line, I've never seen it before, and then I would say that it is also inaccurate. It does not.
We've talked about it. Move on.
You made a statement about agreeing with your lab, but questioning the narcotics analgesics being the only thing in the defendant's system. Can you explain that for us, please?
Just like the cases that defense brought up, sometimes drugs can't be seen through lab tests. Sometimes there's a presumptive positive, which is the lower standard, and then there's the proof positive standard of our lab, and this has been explained to us as DREs as we complain to the lab, like you're saying it's there, but you can't say it's there because it doesn't meet a certain standard, which is the way the lab needs to work. And we understand that, but it's a little frustrating to say it was there, but we can't mark it as being there. So in the couple of cases that were brought up where it was a blood test, the way that drugs go through the body is they go into the blood and then are metabolized through the blood and pass through and end up in waste. So I don't know what exactly was shown beyond that cutoff level. if there was still residual amounts of impairing drugs in that presumptive level. What I also don't know is that the lab, I know that our lab cannot test for a lot of synthetic drugs. A lot of the chemical-only drugs, as opposed to like narcotic analgesics, or a lot of those are derived from opium. So that's why I call it opiates, and that's a natural occurring. So synthetics are chemical only, and it takes very little to tweak that and change the chemical makeup. And the lab can only test for what the lab knows about. And so a lot of analogs don't get caught. That's why the synthetic cannabinoids that people admitted smoking and using come back negative as a lab result, because the lab can't test for those substances.
And you were asking questions in regard to your rolling law, correct?
Yes, I was.
Why do you maintain a rolling law?
For accountability.
And based on your review of your rolling log, what's your percentage of accuracy?
I think it was 96% accurate, including instructor evaluations. So instructor evaluations are typically, most of those are at field certification, where we take students to a location. Currently our program's using a facility down in Florida, where people come into the facility to get aid and help and counseling and things like that. A lot of those people that come in self-report as being as having used drugs. So we provide them with an incentive to come up to where our students are, and then the students put them through the DRE process and show them, show their instructor that they know what they're doing, and then that they can make the correct call as to what the person is under the influence of. All of those people are given a number and a pseudo fake name. Some of them give their real name that we call them by during the evaluation, and they're also given a rapid drug screen. So they all void into a container that will test their urine for a handful of drugs, the most common ones really. And so at the end of the evaluation, the students have to tell the instructor what they believe the person is under the influence of, and then the instructor looks through their face sheet, is what it's called. It's where we keep all of our notes, and determines whether or not what they saw and what they did matches the drug category that they called. And then we go back and we check the drug screen to see if it's in fact correct. If it looks like they're a little bit off.
Object, non-responsive.
Sustained.
You were asked questions about not being able to testify as to which category the defendant's impairment was in, but you still reached a conclusion on impairment, correct?
Yes.
How were you able to still reach a conclusion on his impairment?
Just because I'm not 100% sure what categories were involved. What I saw in him equated to impairment. The totality of the circumstances, everything that I looked at from the initial crash all the way through to the end of the finger and the nose test, and everything that I've talked repeatedly about, all of that together added up to my opinion that he's absolutely impaired.
And was your evaluation of the defendant confirmed by the lab results?
I can't answer that.
Nothing further at this time, Your Honor.
Mr. Sen?
Nothing, Your Honor. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to stop here. I thank you for your patience with us. Tomorrow morning, if you got there at 9, I'm hoping we won't have anybody that's ill or anything else, that any equipment malfunctions, those types of things. that we'll be able to start more timely. Keep in mind, I'll discuss this case, don't let anyone discuss it with you. I'll forward express.
That was the Gasper trial wrapping for the day. We saw testimony for most of the day by the officer who conducted all of the field sobriety tests. Commitment on behalf of the prosecution to stick to this impairment theory of the case. I'm here with Julie Rendelman. She's a LawNewz legal analyst. Julie, so we were having a field day. I wish we had more time.
Oh yeah, this was a good one.
Yeah, so Officer Gable, there's so much to break down. So let's kind of go to what happened later this afternoon, because I think there were a lot of great moments during the cross-examination. The first being the defense attorney saying, okay, so have you ever gotten this wrong? You're talking about a totality of the circumstances, your objective view of impairment, listing a litany of cases where apparently Officer Gable thought the person was impaired and they were not. What do you make of this?
I thought his cross-examination was fantastic. I mean, we were actually both chuckling throughout. When you can get, by the way, the jury, which you can hear the whole audience kind of laughing along with him, because you know, the next thing he does besides kind of call him out on all these cases of which he kind of got it wrong, is he started to call him out on his own behavior on the stand as being an indicator of perhaps being drunk, which is clearly not what he was either. And I thought he was brilliant.
That was really a mic drop moment, Julie.
Oh,
I mean, we looked at each other.
Great.
So obviously the defense theory of the case is, hey, look, he might have been acting a little weird or a little off, but it was because he was nervous, he was in shock, he's being spoken to by a police officer.
Sure.
And
a guy just died. And a guy just died in a car crash.
Yeah, and so the defense attorney on cross, he says, well, didn't the court reporter ask you to slow down, officer? And maybe that's because of nerves. And like you said, Julie, we got a roar from the jury.
Oh, it was absolutely fantastic. And now he said to him, well, when he goes, she actually had to say it a few times to you, and she actually has had to say it to me. Are you saying that I'm, inebriated or you're inebriated? And it was so well done, especially keeping in mind that with the categories they're using, he doesn't have Gasper, he doesn't have him, doing wrong with all of the 8 different, tests. He only has him doing 1 or 2, and so I thought it was just absolutely perfect.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was an excellent cross-examination. So let's talk about that fact. So you've got this 8-factor test that's supposed to evaluate whether someone's impaired.
Right.
So the defense attorney asked about that. Obviously, Gasper was nowhere near all 8. We're talking about 1 or 2. And then the officer went on to explain, well, it's not that exact of a science. There's this totality of the circumstances based on every single thing I view. And the defense attorney said on cross, he said, okay, then why have the test?
Exactly. By the way, it made no sense. I mean, on the one hand, I think we started to talk about the fact that he actually said, and I could be wrong, that the lab is wrong, that almost that the lab doesn't know what they're doing. So now we have that the lab doesn't know how to detect drugs in a human being, and then he has this kind of his own system of doing things where it doesn't really matter what the 8 signs are of intoxication or inebriation or drug use. It's just kind of his own version of what he perceives as what he should be looking for. And so it makes it kind of the standard that makes absolutely no sense. And how can a jury even buy what he's saying if he can't even, if the defendant themselves doesn't fall into any of those categories?
Yeah, and we had been really looking forward to Gable's testimony from the perspective of, hey, let's see what exactly this case is made up of. But you brought up a great point. So also, he got into the lab, and that there's a lot of drugs that will leave the system that might not, synthetic drugs, he said, that are derivatives of opiates, and they might leave the system, so they might not be detected anyway, even though someone may have taken them. Now, we kind of had a difference of opinion on the purpose of the prosecution bringing this up. I thought that perhaps the prosecution was trying to say, look, it might not have just been methadone in this guy's system. There might have been something else that was causing impairment that's undetectable. You had a different theory.
I thought that they were trying to, protect the witness by basically saying that the incidents of which the defense attorney referred to, of those various names of various defendants in the past where he had said that they were either intox or on some type of drug and found out later that there were no drugs in his system, I thought they were trying to kind of establish that he may have been right about it, but the lab was wrong. Your perspective is, maybe they're basically adding, maybe the jury should think that somehow there was more in his system than methadone. I think they're going far afield if they're going down that road, because there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever in this case that in any way establishes he was using any other drug other than methadone. And I think that's a foolish move if that's where they're going.
Yeah, I think from the impairment perspective, which again, the prosecution is very committed to this theory, and part of that might be what exactly happened during that accident scene, that they don't really have necessarily reckless conduct. And you and I spoke about this also. We're looking forward to that accident reconstruction specialist to really understand what happened that day on the road, where the cars are placed and all that. But from an impairment perspective, all of this testimony by Gable, this objective test that's almost doesn't even matter because he's using a subjective totality of the circumstances test, also in the face of the fact that there were further evaluations that could have been conducted that are more dispositive that weren't.
Right, exactly. And which, by the way, remember, this is a case that's before a jury, and the jury has to make a decision whether or not he's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And you have the main witness who's there to talk about how he appeared, and that he appeared to be under the influence of some type of drug. And he's now saying, well, you know what, there's stuff we could have done, we just didn't do it. I think one of the things, though, I want to make sure we touch upon is the one line he gives, which is when we talk about beyond a reasonable doubt, you now have a witness on the stand who on cross-examination says, when asked, is it possible, based now on what we're talking about, that he wasn't under the influence? And his answer was yes, that it's possible. I mean, if that doesn't define what beyond a reasonable doubt is, then I don't know what, that doesn't blow it out of the water in terms of going for an acquittal. I don't know what does. And if you notice on redirect, he kind of changed his version and said, oh no, he was under the influence. I think that the prosecutor is going to have such a hard time of getting past this witness.
Oh, definitely. And you're absolutely right. The defense is going to talk about that inconsistency. They're going to really focus on Gable's testimony. He's the one who conducted the test, saw the defendant at the time this happened. So this is going to be a tough case for the prosecution. Julie Rendleman, thank you so much for joining today. We have so much more to talk about, but unfortunately, 5 o'clock has come. So court is adjourned for the day. We will be live in the Gasper courtroom tomorrow morning. Court will start at 9 o'clock. We'll also be keeping an eye on the Michelle Carter case. The verdict is coming out tomorrow. The prosecution pushing for 20 years, the defense asking for probation only. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. We will also be keeping an eye on the Campbell case. Right now, that is suspended unknown amount of time because of an issue with the juror, but we will be here with all of those, giving you updates live in the Gasper courtroom tomorrow morning. I'm Misty Maris, and thank you so much for joining us today at Law News.